Okay, so last we left it, we were talking about the Danwei, okay, and how this essentially added another patriarchal figure in the lives of women of this particular generation. The reorganization of all Chinese into work teams, residential brigades, etc., gave the party, the CCP, unprecedented capacity to project power into families and mold them. One consequence was that women often found their lives run by mothers, fathers, and the Danwei, who acted as matchmakers, decided matters on housing, and as a judge in marital disputes between husbands and wives. Overwhelmingly, these figures were men who sided against women and with their parents or their husbands, negating many of the benefits that had initially been produced by the CCP's laws on inheritance and things like divorce. So essentially, it was another patriarchal figure that exerted a lot of dominance and stifled a lot of the freedoms and opportunities that women had that existed within Maoist China. For women, then, that had been in their teens and early 20s, there was the added injury of the Cultural Revolution. Their education was disrupted, and the chaos that ensued as factions of Red Guards clashed allowed scores of men to violate, sexually harass, and assault women under the guise that they were being struggled against by patriots. Then later, these women were sent to the countryside, far from friends and families, to a place where they were again very vulnerable to exploitation or forced into unwanted marriages and relationships. Returning from exile in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of them hoped to resume their education or find the means to make a living, only to find a subtle shift in the government and society's attitudes toward women. With unemployment on occasion surging, with the reduction of the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and the loss of iron rice bowls, media and public commentators encouraged women to return to traditional roles in the home as wives and homemakers and mothers. This despite the fact that women made up a very large share of the recently unemployed, assigned to auxiliary or service sectors because these jobs and areas of manufacturing of the economy and manufacturing were seen as unfit for men. A lot of these women were the first targeted for the reforms and thus forced out into the unemployment lines. Other women, though, were encouraged to make a sacrifice by giving up the jobs that they had for the good of the country, taking an early retirement as early as the age of 40. Depicted in official media as comfortable, contented, and leisurely in their retirement from the workforce, in truth, many of these very same women went back out into the economy, inventing for themselves new streams of income and identity as street vendors. For women born and raised in rural areas, though, the rapid change produced by the Ford modernization also meant difficult choices. Most of the millions of migrants moving in the 1980s to China's urban coast to enter the free labor market for hire were men, which left women behind to meet the agricultural quotas for production demanded by the CCP of small villages and communities. While there, these rural women worked alongside the elderly and their children, the expectations for caring for each set falling almost entirely on them as their husbands were off in far cities remitting home incomes. The increasingly stark rural-urban divide in China, the gap between the wealthy, the privileged, and the elite, and those increasingly being left behind, measured in things like income, health, access to education, and healthcare, or the ownership of modern conveniences. In this respect, we can also see that mapped out and divided by sex. Rural women were also in these areas especially vulnerable to cadres that enriched themselves by arranging marriages and forcing widows to remarry, collecting a bride price. The custom, which often boiled down to the buying and selling of women, repeated one of the great illicit trades in human beings of the late Qing dynasty. Aware of the parallels between that era and that of the new era being formed under the CCP, the party took action, creating a marriage law in 1980 that enhanced the right of women to file for divorce and bring forward charges of abuse at the hands of their husband. A surge in divorces would actually help spur the return of law as a needed profession that was valued in society, particularly as the state and these young lawyers grappled with the question of how to divide custody in an era of the one-child policy, and property in an era in which increasingly rural farm members had rights to the plots that they farmed, the draft animals, the tools, the equipment, etc. In essence, they had more property and private property. In the 1980s, though, women from all walks of life had to adapt to the nation's new one-child policy and how it impacted their marriages and their plans for family. For a small number, it granted women an important space to carve out greater freedom, giving them permission to delay marriage or refuse to have children altogether, acts that could be celebrated as patriotic and making a contribution to the health of the nation, even if their neighbors likely still questioned them for having an unconventional lifestyle. For most mothers, though, it subjected them to intense pressure from the father and the Danwei and much of society to produce a son. The idea of the son carrying on the family name was old and patriarchal, but no less prevalent now in the 1980s than it had been a century ago. The CCP's concession, after a few years, to allow families to have a second child, if the firstborn was a daughter, gave these mothers another chance, but it didn't relieve any of the pressure on them on the second try to have a son. In fact, it likely made it worse. Under duress, given the constraints on childbearing and family by the CCP, a number of Chinese in the 1980s and thereafter chose the last resort, female infanticide. How many young women were aborted or killed is a matter of speculation and intense controversy. True enough, female infanticide has a much longer history as a practice in China and even many other cultures around the world. But the stories about female infanticide in China during the 1980s had often been reliant on rumor rather than hard evidence, and they're subjective to sensationalism that often treats the most extreme cases as typical and commonplace across society. The textbook notes a figure estimating an annual number of 200,000 a year lost to female infanticide, which is based on the work of demographers and other experts that have sought to explain the resulting gender imbalance seen in China. While the one-child policy effectively reined in China's population growth to manageable levels by the 1990s, recognition of that gender imbalance and its repercussions for the nation's future represented a new problem caused specifically by the one-child policy, one that led the CCP to prohibit the use of new technologies such as ultrasonography that allowed couples to find out the sex of a baby before birth. This was meant as a means to curb the practice of female infanticide. In meeting the challenges created by population pressure in the 1980s, the CCP's one-child policy was a seminal experience for a unique generation of women. Women whose lives were disrupted and torn apart by the Maoist era that talked of their own resignation to chew or eat bitterness. Faced with burdens that were conventional and traditional, as mothers, and also unusual and unique as the first generation to adapt to the one-child policy, many women gave up the idea of their own hopes to achieve equality, opportunity, and claim new rights. Instead, focusing on rearing the next generation and securing for their own daughters, if they had them, what they had only hoped to dream and achieve in their own life. A lingering problem, though, was how the efforts to control population growth had also created new problems, the gender imbalance, but also a society that was no longer defined by youth, but a ballooning aging population that required one child as an adult to replace the productivity and revenue created by the retirement of 4 grandparents, and then later their mother and their father in the workforce. The question of not only who will provide for, but take care of China's elders has put China's women squarely back at the center of a debate about the demands of society, the CCP, the family, and how that relates to population. Okay, we have 2 more lectures to go through next week. We'll talk about 1989, and we'll talk a little bit broadly about China since that moment in June 4th, okay? And wrap up the course. Hopefully you saw this week that your final exam is posted. Get in touch with me if you have questions. Otherwise, be well and finish out the semester strong.